Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The sand has found its way into every wound. Nefertari is 24 years old, and she can feel the grit grinding into the raw flesh where ropes have flayed her wrists. Each breath carries the taste of blood and dust across cracked lips. The smell of fear, her own, mixes with the sour animal stench of the donkeys that have dragged her cart across the desert for 11 days. 16 days ago, she was the wife of Amenhotep, chief scribe of the Temple of Amun at Thebes, a woman who wore linen so sheer it caught light like water, who ate from plates of faience, who had servants to oil her skin and braid her hair with threads of gold. Now she kneels inside a wooden cage mounted on wheels, her head shaved bare, scalp blistering beneath the upper Egyptian sun. A coarse linen shift hangs from her shoulders, its fibers rough enough to raise welts wherever it touches skin. This too is intentional. Too fine a garment would suggest she still possessed status. Too poor would imply she was not worth transporting. This precise level of discomfort marked her as exactly what the court had declared her to be. The sentence had been delivered without anger, without cruelty, without acknowledgement that her life was being ended while her body remained alive. Her husband had been accused of stealing from the temple treasury. The evidence was false. She knew it. The priests knew it. Everyone knew it. But Amenhotep's rival had influence, and influence meant truth was unnecessary. Amenhotep was condemned to the copper mines, where men rarely survived more than 2 years. Nefertari was condemned to something else. The legal code described it in language so clinical she hadn't understood at first, given to the soldiers of the garrison at Buhen. She had asked what given meant, what status she would retain, what rights, if any, remained hers. The magistrate had looked at her with an expression she still could not name. "You will have no status," he said. "You will retain no rights. You will become communal property of the garrison. Every soldier, from commander to conscript, will have equal claim to your body. You will serve until released, or until you die." Now, 11 days into the journey toward Egypt's southern frontier, she is beginning to understand. The cart halts. Soldiers approach, faces wrapped against the sand, eyes studying her through folds of cloth. They have been assessing her since the first day, calculating, discussing what will happen when they reach Buhen. This is not chaos. This is not impulse. This is system. A punishment Egypt refined over centuries, a way to erase a woman without execution, to destroy without bloodshed, to remove someone from respectable society while technically keeping her alive. The garrison at Buhen has received women before. The soldiers know the procedures, the commanders understand protocols. There is a bureaucracy of degradation that makes the outcome predictable. A guard unlocks the cage and drags her into the burning sand. He presses a waterskin to her lips, not from mercy, but practicality. Damaged cargo loses value. 3 more days, he says. Then you belong to Buhen. Belong. She drinks and memorizes his face, the guard positions, the supply layout, the direction of the sun. She does not yet know how this information will serve her. But knowledge is the only thing they cannot confiscate. She gathers it carefully. Because when she arrives, she will cease to be a person, and what you are about to learn has been deliberately excluded from the stories that celebrate ancient Egypt as a civilization of pyramids, pharaohs, and gold. The scholars who admire its art rarely ask what happened to those it cast aside. Tonight, you will learn about the punishment the Egyptians called giving to the soldiers. Not execution, not slavery, something worse. A dissolution of identity so complete that the woman vanished, while her body continued to serve purposes the legal codes described only through euphemism. You will learn why this sentence was reserved for crimes that embarrassed powerful men, why it was used to protect temples and institutions, and what waited for women sent to the frontier garrisons, places designed to make people disappear, isolated outposts where 300 soldiers lived for years without leave, without families, without access to the women of respectable society. You will learn what happened in those garrisons, not in graphic detail, but in the systematic reality that the sources preserve. You will learn about the women who survived because some did survive, emerging after years of garrison service into a world that did not know what they had endured, that had no framework for understanding what had been done to them. You will learn what happened to these survivors, how they rebuilt lives from fragments, how some chose silence and some chose testimony, how the stories that survived were almost always filtered through male scribes who had their own reasons for recording or concealing. You will learn why Egyptian sources describe this punishment so rarely, why the legal codes that authorize it use language so vague that scholars have debated for decades what it actually meant. You will learn that the vagueness was deliberate, that the punishment was designed to be unspeakable in the literal sense, something that respectable Egyptians did not speak about directly, because speaking about it would acknowledge realities they preferred to ignore. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness beneath Egypt's golden surface. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Nefertari is 3 days away from Buhan, 3 days away from becoming communal property of 300 soldiers, 3 days away from discovering what given actually means. And I am going to tell you exactly what she experienced. But before I reveal what happened to Nefertari in that garrison, before I explain the system that processed her and the years that changed her, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Egyptian justice functioned, why this punishment existed, and what made it worse than the alternatives that seem more obviously terrible. Because you cannot understand what Nefertari endured without understanding the logic that created her fate. Egyptian justice was not designed to be fair. It was designed to maintain order, protect the powerful, and make examples of those who threatened a stability that allowed civilization to function along the narrow strip of fertile land bordering the Nile. The legal system had developed over nearly 2,000 years by the time Nefertari's sentence was pronounced. It was sophisticated, bureaucratic, documented in records that allow modern scholars to reconstruct its operations in considerable detail. Egyptians believed in Mahat, the cosmic principle of order and justice, and they believed that their legal system embodied this principle, that the punishments they imposed were not merely practical, but cosmically appropriate. This belief allowed them to impose punishments of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining absolute certainty that they were acting righteously. The punishment system was graduated according to the severity of the offense and the status of the offender. Minor crimes might result in beatings, fines, or forced labor. More serious crimes could lead to mutilation, the cutting off of ears, nose, or hands, or to the copper mines, where conditions were so brutal that sentences of more than 2 years were effectively death sentences. The most serious crimes against the state or the gods warranted execution, sometimes by impalement, sometimes by being thrown to the crocodiles, sometimes by being burned alive. But there were also crimes that occupied a peculiar middle ground, crimes that were serious enough to require severe punishment, but that involved circumstances making standard punishments inappropriate. Crimes where the guilty party was a man of some status, but his wife was also implicated, even if only by association. Crimes where making an example required punishment that would be visible and memorable, without requiring the expense and ritual pollution of execution. For these crimes, the punishment of giving was available. The practice appears to have originated in the military context. Frontier garrisons isolated for years at a time posed specific problems for military discipline. Soldiers who served at places like Buen or Elephantine were far from their families, far from the women of their communities, far from any acceptable outlet for desires that Egyptian culture normally channeled through marriage and concubinage. Left entirely without sexual access, these soldiers became restless, violent, prone to the kind of disorder that threatened military effectiveness. The solution that emerged was pragmatic in the way that military solutions often are. Certain women, criminals, prisoners of war, sometimes slaves who had offended their owners, were assigned to garrison use. They belonged to no individual soldier. They were communal property available to any man who wanted them, maintained by the garrison command as a collective resource. This system served multiple purposes. It provided an outlet for soldiers' desires, reducing the tensions that might otherwise explode into violence against each other or against the local population. It created a punishment for women that was worse than death, while avoiding the religious complications of execution. It made examples of women whose crimes, or whose husbands' crimes, required visible consequences without requiring visible bodies. The women who were given to garrisons occupied a legal status unlike anything else in Egyptian society. They were not slaves because slaves had owners who bore responsibility for them. They were not prisoners because prisoners were held for specific terms and then released. They were not even property in the normal sense, because property could be bought, sold, inherited, and protected. They were in the legal terminology that survives simply given. The word suggests Transfer suggests that something has changed hands, but it does not specify to whom or for what purpose. The vagueness was intentional. Everyone knew what given meant. No one wanted to specify it directly. Now let us return to Nefertari, who has arrived at the fortress of Buhen after 14 days of travel through the desert. The fortress is larger than she expected. Stone walls rise 40 feet from the sand, crenellated and watchtowered, designed to withstand siege by Nubian armies that have tested Egyptian power for generations. Inside the walls, she can see barracks, storehouses, a small temple, the administrative buildings where Garrison Command manages the complex logistics of keeping 300 men alive and functional on the edge of hostile territory. The escort hands her over to a garrison officer who examines documents, makes notes on a tablet, and gestures for her to be taken to a building near the western wall. She memorizes the path, the positions of the guards, the layout of the fortress as she is led through streets that fall silent when she passes. The soldiers know what she is. They have seen women like her before. The building near the western wall is small, perhaps 20 feet by 30, divided into a main room and a smaller chamber at the back. The main room contains bedding of a sort, rough mats arranged along the walls, blankets that have seen better decades, a few wooden stools. The smaller chamber contains a latrine pit and a basin for washing. The walls are mud brick, the floor packed earth, the ceiling low enough that a tall man would have to duck. A woman emerges from the shadows of the main room. She is perhaps 35, her face weathered, her body bearing marks that Nefertari recognizes from the injuries she herself sustained during transport. But her eyes are what hold Nefertari's attention. They are flat, empty, the eyes of someone who has seen everything and retreated to a place where nothing can reach her. "I am Hanut Mahit," the woman says. "I have been here for 6 years. I will explain how things work. How many of us are there?" 3. Now that you have arrived. There were 4 until last month. Situ died. Fever. The commander said it was not fever. Nefertari absorbs this information. 3 women for 300 soldiers. The mathematics of what this implies is staggering. "How do we survive?" she asks. Hanut Mahit's expression does not change. Most of us do not. The average is 2 years. I have survived 6 because I learned things that the others did not learn. I will teach you if you are capable of learning. What things? Which soldiers are dangerous and which are merely brutal? Which officers have enough authority to provide protection in exchange for exclusivity? How to maintain your health when everything in this place is designed to destroy it? How to remain yourself inside when everything outside is trying to erase you? She gestures toward one of the mats. "Rest now. Tonight, the commander will summon you. He claims first access to all new arrivals. After that, you will be made available to the garrison. The first week is the worst. If you survive the first week, you have a chance of surviving longer." Nefertari sits on the mat. She has been assigned. The rough fabric scratches against her legs, already raw from the journey. She can hear sounds from outside, soldiers calling to each other, the clatter of equipment, the ordinary noises of military life that will be the backdrop to her existence for however long she lasts. "What happened to you?" she asks Hanut Mahit. "What was your crime?" "My husband was a priest who objected to the wrong policy. He was sent to the mines. I was sent here." She pauses. "He died in the first year. I learned about it from a supply officer who thought the information might make me more cooperative." "Did it? No. Nothing makes us more cooperative. Nothing makes any of this acceptable. But we learn to endure because the alternative is to die. And dying is easy here. Living is hard. I have chosen hard." She retreats to her own mat, leaving Nefertari alone with questions she does not yet know how to ask. The commander's name was Kasset, and he was not what Nefertari expected. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of a career soldier, and the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many years in places he did not want to be. His quarters were austere by the standards of Egyptian officers, functional furniture, no decorations beyond a small shrine to Amun, none of the luxuries that men of his rank typically accumulated. He sat behind a table covered with documents and watched her approach with an expression she could not read. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a stool across the table from him. She sat. The stool was low enough that she had to look up at him, a deliberate arrangement that reinforced the power differential between them. But his tone was not harsh, and his eyes, when they met hers, held something other than the predatory calculation she had seen. and other men since her sentencing. You are Nefertari, wife of Amenhotep, formerly chief scribe of the Temple of Amun. I am. Your husband was convicted of theft from the temple treasury. The evidence suggests he was framed by a rival named Userhat, who had connections to the high priest's faction. Your husband was sent to the copper mines. You were sent here. She had not expected him to know the details of her case. She had not expected him to mention that Amenhotep was framed to acknowledge what everyone knew, but no one admitted. You seem well informed, she said. I make it my business to know who is sent to my garrison and why. It helps me understand what I am dealing with. He leaned back in his chair. I also make it my business to understand the political currents and thieves. Userhat is a dangerous man. He destroyed your husband to eliminate a rival, and he destroyed you to ensure that no one with knowledge of your husband's innocence would remain in a position to cause trouble. If you know he was innocent, why does that change nothing? Because justice and truth are different things. Justice is what the courts declare. Truth is what actually happened. Egypt runs on justice, not truth. I have learned this over 30 years of service. He rose from the table and moved to a cabinet where he poured wine into 2 cups. He handed one to her, a gesture so unexpected that she almost dropped it. You are now communal property of this garrison. He said the legal codes are clear about what that means. You have no status, no rights, no protections beyond what I choose to provide. Every soldier in this fortress, from my officers to the lowest conscript, has equal claim to your person. I understand. I do not think you do. Not yet. He sat back down, his wine untouched. There are 300 soldiers in this garrison. Most of them have been here for years with no leave, no families, no access to women outside of those assigned to communal use. They are not evil men, most of them, but they are men under conditions that erode the restraints that civilization normally imposes. What happens to you here will not be the result of particular cruelty. It will be the result of system of numbers of what 300 men without other outlets will do when a woman is made available to them. Then why tell me this? Why give me wine and explain my situation as if I were a person rather than cargo? Kamoet was silent for a long moment before answering. Because I am tired, he said finally, tired of this posting, tired of this system, tired of pretending that what happens here is justice rather than organized brutality. I have commanded this garrison for 12 years. I have watched 11 women arrive in your position. 3 survived to be released. 8 died. I could not save any of them. Perhaps I cannot save you either. But I can at least acknowledge that you are a person being fed into a machine, rather than pretending that the machine is righteous. What happened to the 3 who survived? They were released when the terms of their sentences ended, or when political circumstances changed enough that their continued punishment became inconvenient. They returned to Egypt. I do not know what became of them afterward. How long is my sentence? Your sentence has no term. You are given to this garrison until you are released or until you die. Release requires a petition to the authorities and thieves, which requires someone with influence to file it. Since Userhat has influence and you have none, I would not expect release unless circumstances change significantly. Nefertari absorbed this information. No fixed term, no expectation of release, only endurance until death or until something changed that she could not predict or control. You said you cannot save me, she said. But you also said some women survived. What made them different? Cosette looked at her with something that might have been approval. They found purposes, he said. Reasons to continue that went beyond mere biological persistence. They built strategies for managing what happened to them. They created alliances with me, with other women, sometimes with soldiers who were less brutal than average and could be cultivated as protectors. Will you protect me? I will do what I can within the limits of my position. I am commander of this garrison, but I am also subject to regulations and expectations that I cannot openly violate. I can claim first access to new arrivals. That is expected, a privilege of rank. I can assign you to duties that reduce your availability to the general population for portions of the day. I can punish soldiers who damage garrison property excessively. Property, she repeated. That is what I am. That is what the law declares you to be. What you are inside your own mind is something only you can determine. He rose from the table. The interview apparently concluded. Tonight you will stay here in my quarters. Tomorrow you will be assigned to the women's building and made available to the garrison. Use tonight to rest, to think, to prepare yourself for what is coming. What is coming? I will not describe it. You will learn soon enough. But I will tell you this. The first week is the worst. Survive the first week and you have a chance. Give up during the first week and you will not last a month." He turned away, dismissing her to the small chamber attached to his quarters, where she would spend what might be her last night as something other than communal property. She lay on the bed he had provided, a real bed with actual linens, the last comfort she would experience for who knew how long, and tried to prepare for something she could not imagine. The morning brought the reality that Kaimo had refused to describe. She was taken to the women's building and formally introduced to her role in the garrison. The introduction was performed by the third woman, a younger one named Merit, who had arrived 2 years earlier and had survived through a combination of luck and the protection of a sergeant who claimed her more often than others. "There are patterns," Merit explained. "The soldiers come in waves. Dawn, when the night guard is released. Midday, when those not on duty have free time. Evening, after the main meal. Late night, when those who cannot sleep become restless. How many in a day? It varies. Sometimes 10, sometimes 30. On festival days when wine is distributed, it can be more. The worst is after a Nubian raid, when soldiers return with the aggression of combat still in their blood. Those nights are difficult." Nefertitari filed this information away. Patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant the possibility of strategy. Who is the most dangerous? A sergeant named Senefer. He claims to be the son of a nobleman from Memphis. Though no one believes him, he enjoys causing pain. He requests women specifically so he can hurt them. Sitmut, the one who died, was his favorite. What he did to her is why she died. How does he get away with it? He is careful. He knows how much damage he can inflict without crossing the line that would require a Kate to act. He knows the regulations, the loopholes, the ways to destroy a woman slowly enough that it can be attributed to accumulated wear rather than specific abuse. And the commander allows this. The commander is constrained by regulations he did not write. Senefer has patrons and thieves, relatives who hold minor positions in the administration. Disciplining him requires documentation, process, justification. Kaimaset has done what he can assign Senefer to duties that keep him busy. Limited his access, warned women to avoid triggering his interest, but he cannot eliminate the threat entirely. Nefertari memorized the name. Senefer, the specific danger within the general horror. What about protection? You mentioned cultivating soldiers who are less brutal. Some soldiers are capable of something resembling attachment. If you can identify one, if you can make yourself valuable to him beyond the physical, he may claim you often enough that others have less access. This is not safety, but it is better than being available to everyone equally. How do I identify such men? You will learn. Some are obvious. They hesitate. They speak to you like a person. They show discomfort with what they are doing. Others hide their humanity beneath masks, and you must watch carefully to see the cracks. The conversation was interrupted by the first soldiers of the day, men coming off night watch who pushed into the building with the expectation of what awaited them. Merit fell silent. Hanut Mahaite, who had been listening from across the room, retreated to a corner with the practiced invisibility of long experience. Nefertitari faced what was coming with eyes open, mind working, determination to survive, solidifying into something hard and cold in her chest. She would learn the patterns. She would identify the dangers. She would find the cracks in masks and exploit whatever advantages presented themselves. She would be what they required her to be on the outside while remaining herself on the inside. She would survive. Now, I need to tell you something about the Egyptian frontier garrisons that helps explain what Nefertitari experienced. The fortresses along Egypt's southern border with Nubia were not merely military installations. They were complete worlds unto themselves, isolated communities where several hundred men lived for years at a time with minimal contact with the civilization they served. They were posted there because Egypt needed to control the trade routes that brought gold, ivory, ebony, and slaves from the south. They remained there because the cost and complexity of rotation made regular relief impractical. These conditions shaped everything about garrison life. The men who served at Buhan and similar fortresses were not volunteers. They were conscripts, laborers impressed into military service. Minor criminals offered army duty as an alternative to worse punishments. Occasional professional soldiers who had offended someone powerful enough to exile them to the frontier. They had not chosen to be there. They did not want to be there. They were trapped in the same way that Nefertari was trapped, though their cages were larger and their status nominally different. This shared entrapment created a peculiar psychology. The soldiers resented their situation. They could not express this resentment toward the commanders who controlled them or the system that had placed them there, but they could express it toward those beneath them in the hierarchy, the slaves who served the garrison, the Nubian prisoners taken in raids, and the women who had been given for their use. The women became targets for frustrations that had nothing to do with them personally. They became objects on which soldiers could enact anger, humiliation, powerlessness that they could not safely express in any other direction. The violence they experienced was not purely sexual. It was emotional, psychological, a complex release of feelings that garrison conditions had compressed into explosive potential. The commanders understood this dynamic and managed it accordingly. They knew that the women served as pressure valves, that the system's cruelty was functional, that 3 women destroyed over a period of years was an acceptable cost for maintaining order among 300 men who might otherwise become unmanageable. This was the logic that had created Nefertitari's situation, not individual sadism, though sadism certainly existed within the system, but institutional calculation, the cold mathematics of control, the recognition that someone had to absorb the pressures that garrison life generated and that women with no status, no rights, no legal existence were the most efficient choice. The system was designed. The system was maintained. The system consumed women like Nefertari at a predictable rate and treated this consumption as a necessary operating cost. This is what she had been fed into. This is what she had to survive. The first week was exactly as terrible as Kaimoet had warned. Nefertari experienced what she would later describe when she eventually told her story as a dissolution. The boundary between herself and what was being done to her seemed to blur, to soften, to threaten, to disappear entirely. She felt herself retreating into a small space, deep inside, a refuge where she could wait out the assaults like waiting out a sandstorm, knowing it would pass, knowing that if she stayed small enough and still enough, she might survive it. She learned to count the men who used her in the first week, 37 by her count, though some returned multiple times, and she might have miscounted. The time became hazy, individual incidents blurring together into a continuous experience of use that had no clear boundaries. But she counted, because counting maintained a kind of structure, a framework of numbers that replaced the framework of selfhood that she felt slipping away. She learned to observe who was rough and who was merely indifferent, who spoke during the encounters and who remained silent, who looked at her face and who avoided her eyes entirely. These observations became data, and data became the foundation for strategy. She learned to identify Senefer, the sergeant that Merritt had warned her about. He was a large man, heavy-set, with a face that might have been handsome before cruelty had carved its permanent expression into his features. He came to the women's building on her 3rd day, and something in the way his eyes moved over her told her that she had attracted his interest, that she would need to be very careful. He did not select her that day. He selected Henut Mayet instead, and what Nefertitari heard from the smaller chamber, not screaming because Henut had learned that screaming provoked him, but sounds of impact and muffled pain confirmed everything Merritt had told her. When Senefer left, Nefertari went to Henut Mayet and helped her clean the blood from cuts that had been carefully placed where they would not show. Henut Mayet accepted the help without comment, her eyes flat, her face showing nothing. He was testing, Hen Mahat said finally. Testing whether you would intervene. Testing whether you would provide him with an excuse to add you to his interests. I almost did intervene. I know. I saw you move. That is why I did not cry out. If you had come into the room, he would have had both of us, and neither of us would have survived what followed. How do you know? Because that is what happened to Sitmut. She tried to help a new arrival. Senefer used it as justification. She lasted another month after that, but she was already dying. Nefertari absorbed the lesson. Intervention was dangerous. Solidarity could be exploited. Survival required calculation, not impulse. Then how do we help each other? Quietly, indirectly. Information, protection during recovery, teaching what we have learned, never openly, never in ways that Centurer can use against us. This became the first of many lessons in the particular survival strategies that the women's building required. 2 Mont. After Nefertari's arrival, she identified the first crack she had been looking for. His name was Beki, and he was a junior scribe attached to the garrison's administrative section. He was perhaps 25, young for his position, sent to Buin as punishment for some minor error that had annoyed his superiors and thieves. Unlike the career soldiers who comprised most of the garrison, he had education, perspective, the remnants of civilized sensibility that desert service had not yet entirely erased. He came to the women's building with the awkwardness of someone who did not want to be there, but could not find a way to explain this to his peers. He hesitated at the door. He actually apologized before taking what the system entitled him to take. He did not hurt her beyond what the act itself required, and when it was over, he did not leave immediately. He sat on the edge of the mat and asked her name. Nefertari, she said. Wife of Amenhotep, formerly chief scribe of the Temple of Amun. Beki's expression shifted. Amenhotep. I knew his work. He was respected in the scribal community. His commentaries on the Book of the Dead were considered authoritative. You are a scribe. I am. This posting is temporary, or at least I tell myself it is temporary. When I complete my term, I will return to Thebes and resume my career. He paused. I did not know that Amenhotep's wife was here. I did not know what happened to her. Now you know, now I know, and I am. He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the situation. I am sorry. That means nothing. I understand. But I am sorry. It means something. Nefertitari said, It means you see me as a person. Most of them do not. This was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Beki returned to the women's building with increasing frequency, always selecting Nefertari, claiming enough of her time, that other soul. Dyer's access was somewhat reduced. He brought her things, extra food from the officers' mess, a blanket that was less rough than the standard issue, eventually books, papyrus scrolls that he smuggled from the garrison's small library. She read them in secret in the hours between demands, hiding them beneath her mat when soldiers approached. She discussed them with Beki during his visits, conversations that must have seemed bizarre literary analysis conducted in the aftermath of encounters that neither of them wanted, but that the system required. She was not using him, or rather, she was using him, but she was also genuinely grateful, genuinely connected to him in the way that desperate people connect to those who see them as human. He was her access to the world she had lost, the civilization of letters and ideas and conversations that had meaning beyond survival. And he was her protection. Not complete protection. She was still available to others, still subject to the attentions of men who saw her only as function, but partial protection, enough to give her breathing room, enough to allow her to maintain the internal structure that kept herself from dissolving entirely. He not height noticed. You have found a patron, she said one evening when they were alone in the building. That is good. It may help you survive. Is that what you did? Found a patron? I tried 3 times. The first was killed in a Nubian raid. The second was rotated to a different posting. The third, she was silent for a moment. The third became something other than a patron. Something that required me to accept things I did not want to accept in exchange for protection I could not afford to lose. What happened to him? He is still here. He still claims me regularly. I have learned to provide what he needs, and he has learned to protect me from the worst of what the garrison offers. Her voice was flay. Her eyes empty. It is not life, but it is survival. Nefertari understood that she was being told something important. That survival in this place required transactions that went beyond the obvious, that the alliances formed in the women's building had depths and complications that simple descriptions could not capture. She also understood that she would do whatever was necessary. She had made that decision in the first week, when the dissolution had threatened to consume her, when the option of surrendering had presented itself with seductive clarity. She had chosen survival. She would continue choosing survival, whatever that required. 6 months after her arrival, the pattern that had begun to form was disrupted. A new woman arrived at Buhin. Her name was Iset Noret, and she was 17 years old. Her crime was being the daughter of a provincial administrator who had supported the wrong faction in a political dispute. Her father had been executed. Her mother had been given to a different garrison. She had been given to Buhan. She arrived in worse condition than Nefertitari had. The escort that brought her had not been as careful with the merchandise, and she bore bruises and cuts that would take weeks to heal. She also arrived with a terror so complete that she could barely speak, barely move, barely process what was happening to her. Nefertari looked at this girl and saw something she recognized. Saw the dissolution beginning, the retreat into a small internal space, the surrender that would lead to destruction within weeks if it was not interrupted. She remembered what Hinmad had said about Sitmut, about the danger of open intervention, about how Senefer had used solidarity as a weapon. But she also remembered what she had decided. That survival required purpose. That endurance without meaning became merely prolonged death. This girl could be her purpose. I will chew, she told Isnaf that night when the first wave of soldiers had finished and the building was temporarily quiet. I will show you what I have learned. How to manage this place, how to survive it, how to remain yourself inside when everything outside is trying to erase you. Why? Isenafit's voice was barely audible. Why would you help me? Because I need a reason to continue. Because helping you gives me that reason. Because I am not willing to become what they want me to become. And teaching you how to resist is part of my resistance. It was the most honest answer she could give. It was also strategically sound. A protégé, someone to train and protect, would provide structure to her existence, would give her something to care about beyond mere biological persistence. Isno accepted the help. She had no other options. The years that followed were both better and worse than the first 6 months. Better because the patterns had been established, the protections had been secured, the strategies had proven effective. Nefertari knew the garrison now, knew which soldiers to cultivate and which to avoid, knew the rhythms of demand that allowed her to predict when relief might be possible. Beki's patronage had solidified into something stable, and Kaimoet continued to provide what protection his position allowed. Worse because the duration stretched on without visible end. The grind of daily existence, the constant demand, the accumulated weight of what she was enduring, these pressed on her in ways that the initial crisis had not. She found herself sometimes struggling to remember who she had been before Buhan, struggling to recall the feel of fine linen or the taste of food that had not been cooked in garrison kitchens. But Isaac Nafrit gave her purpose. Teaching the younger woman became her project, her mission, the thing that structured her days and gave meaning to her survival. She passed on everything Hanat Mahite had taught her, everything she had learned herself, the accumulated wisdom of endurance that the women's building had developed over years of receiving and consuming women like her. Isnaf was a good student. She was intelligent, observant, capable of the emotional control that survival required. She learned to identify threats, to manage encounters, to maintain the internal separation between what was done to her body and who she was inside. She developed her own strategies, her own protections, eventually her own tentative relationship with a junior officer who provided what patronage he could. The 3rd year passed, then the 4th. Hanutmite, who had survived 6 years when Nefertitari arrived, died in the 7th, not from violence, but from a fever that her exhausted body could not fight. They buried her according to what rites were possible, 3 women performing rituals that the priests of Egypt would not have recognized, honoring someone whose existence the official records did not acknowledge. Merit, the other survivor, was released at the end of her 5th year. Political circumstances had changed in Thebes. The faction that had condemned her husband had fallen from power, and someone had cared enough to file the petition that freed her. She left Buin with nothing but the rough clothing she had been given, and a future that none of them could imagine. New women arrived to replace those who had died or been released. Nefertitari found herself in Henet's former role, the senior survivor, the one who explained the patterns and taught the strategies, and watched new arrivals try to learn what could not really be taught. Senefer remained a constant threat. He had claimed Nefertari twice over the years, and what he had done to her on those occasions had required weeks of recovery. She had learned to make herself as invisible as possible when he was present, to avoid any behavior that might trigger his interest, to provide nothing that he could interpret as provocation. It was not always enough, but it was the best strategy available. Beki was promoted and transferred in the 4th year. Nefertari had known the transfer was coming. He had been honest about his career trajectory, about the temporary nature of his posting, about the life he intended to resume in Thebes. When he left, he promised to petition for her release, to do what he could from Thebes to end her imprisonment. She did not expect him to follow through. She had learned by then that promises made in Buhan rarely survived the journey back to civilization, that men who had seen her as human in this place would find it easier to forget her once they returned to lives where remembering would be inconvenient. But she did not tell him this. She thanked him for his patronage, wished him well in his career, and watched him ride out of the fortress that had been her world for 4 years. She was alone again, or nearly alone. Izzet and Offred remained, the relationship they had built as close to friendship as the garrison allowed. Together, they survived the 5th year, then the 6th, then the beginning of the 7th, and then everything changed. The news arrived with a supply convoy. In the spring of her 7th year, a treaty had been signed with Nubia. The southern frontier was being reorganized. Several garrisons, including Buhin, were being reduced in size or decommissioned entirely. Soldiers would be rotated back to Egypt. The fortress would be maintained by a skeleton crew rather than a full garrison, and the women who had been given to the disbanded garrisons would be released. Nefertari heard this news from Kaim Waset, who summoned her to his quarters for the first time in years. He had aged visibly since her arrival. Grayer, more stooped. The weariness that had marked him from the beginning now carved deep into his features. "You are to be released," he said. "You and I set no fret both. The order comes from thieves, from a scribe named Beki, who apparently has more influence than I realized." Beki. He had kept his promise against all expectation, against the pattern of every other promise that had been made to her in this place. He had kept his promise. "When?" she asked. "Within the month you will travel with the soldiers being rotated back to Egypt. You will be given documents, establishing your status as free women, no longer subject to the original sentence. What you do after that is your concern. What happens to me when I return? What is my status? Can I work? Can I own property? Can I? You are a free woman. Whatever rights free women have, you have. Your sentence has been commuted, your status restored. Whether society will accept you as a free woman is a different question than whether you legally are one." He did not need to explain further. She understood. The stigma of what she had been would follow her. People would know or would guess or would sense something in the way she carried herself that marked her as someone who had been where she had been. Legal freedom was one thing, social acceptance was another. "I want to thank you," she said, "for what protection you provided, for seeing me as human when the system required you to see me as property. I did not do enough. I could not do enough. The system is larger than any one commander, and I was constrained by it, even when I tried to work within it." He looked at her with eyes that held 7 years of accumulated regret. "But I am glad you survived. I am glad you will leave this place alive. Will you leave too? I am being transferred to a posting in Lower Egypt, closer to thieves, closer to the civilization I have been away from or so long. Perhaps I will find ways to make amends for what I participated in here, or perhaps I will simply grow old and die like any other soldier. I do not know." She left his quarters for the last time and returned to the women's building to tell Aysat the news. The journey back to Egypt took 3 weeks, traveling with a convoy of soldiers who were returning to posts they had left years before. Nefertari and Iset Nafrit rode in a wagon that was little different from the one that had brought Nefertari to Buhin 7 years earlier. But the circumstances had changed entirely. They were not cargo anymore. They were passengers, free women traveling under their own authority with documents that established their legal status and resources that Ka Waset had quietly arranged for their journey. They did not talk much during the journey. There was too much to process, too much that had happened, too much that they would need to decide about how to live in a world that did not know what they had survived. When they reached Thebes, they found a city that had changed in their absence. New buildings, new faces, new political arrangements that neither of them understood. The faction that had destroyed Nefertari's husband was gone, replaced by rivals who had no particular interest in her case. The bureaucracy that had sent her to Buhin had forgotten her entirely. Beki met them at the garrison where the convoy ended. He was older, more confident, dressed in the clothes of a mid-ranking official rather than the junior scribe she remembered.